Somewhere on America's northern frontier, a soldier fights for his life. The colors of his coat reveal who he is. They also mark him as an enemy. Discovery means capture, or worse, and each day that passes brings those who hunt him closer. For now, his survival depends entirely on the kindness of strangers. The soldier's name is Daniel Putnam. His 6-foot-tall frame is lean and muscular, his body adapted to outdoor life. This is not the first difficult situation Daniel has found himself in, and it will not be the last. Adventure, it seems, is in his blood. For generations, Daniel's ancestors had shown a remarkable willingness to leave the familiar behind, to cross oceans, move beyond established settlements, and begin again somewhere new. His story, then, begins long before his birth, more than a century earlier, in fact, in England. In the 1630s, roughly 20,000 English men, women, and children, many of them Puritans, increasingly at odds with their king and his church, set out across the Atlantic, seeking the freedom to practice their faith and the promise of a new life in America. Among them was the Putnam family. John and Priscilla Putnam left their home in Buckinghamshire, England, and settled in Salem, Massachusetts, bringing with them their children, including their son Thomas. At about the same time, another English family, the Hollyoaks, was making its own journey across the Atlantic, and before long, the paths of these two immigrant families crossed. Thomas Putnam married Edward Hollyoak's daughter Anne, and together they settled in Salem, where they raised a large family. For the next half-century, the Putnams put down deep roots in the community. And then came 1692 and the Salem witch trials. Putnams were not merely witnesses to what followed. They were at the very center of it. Daniel's Aunt Anne was one of the most prominent and prolific accusers. His grandfather Edward, a deacon in the church, was an active participant himself, bringing accusations and also bolstering and supporting claims that the afflicted were victims of witchcraft. By the time the hysteria ended, many innocent people were dead, families had been destroyed, and the names of Salem and Putnam would forever be associated with one of the darkest episodes in colonial American history. But the Putnam story did not end in Salem. In the generations that followed, members of the family once again began looking beyond the places their parents had called home. By 1725, the Putnam name begins to appear in the records of Sutton, Massachusetts, a young community nearly 50 miles west of Salem. It was in Sutton in 1739 that Isaac Putnam and Anna Fuller welcomed a son. They named him Daniel. But Daniel's childhood would not be an easy one. When he was just 12 years old, his father died. 3 years later, he lost his mother. At 15 years old, Daniel Putnam was an orphan. Taken in by his older brother, Daniel had already learned, long before reaching adulthood, how quickly the familiar could disappear. But if hardship had marked his childhood, the restless spirit of his ancestors had not disappeared. In 1761, Daniel married Anne Chase. The Chases were a prominent family in Sutton. Anne's father, Samuel, had already served the town for years as a selectman and assessor, and held the rank of ensign in the local militia. Her brother Jonathan was just a few years older than Daniel and was also active in the militia. In marrying Anne, Daniel had joined another family with deep traditions of public service and community leadership. Over the next few years, Daniel and Anne began a family of their own. Their daughter Elizabeth was born in 1762. 2 years later came another daughter, whom they named Anne. But married life and 2 small daughters had apparently done little to quiet Daniel's adventurous spirit. In the winter of 1764, he left Anne behind in Sutton with their 2 young daughters, one of them still an infant, and headed north, far north. Beyond the established towns of Massachusetts, into the sparsely settled wilderness of the upper Connecticut River Valley. There, with a man named Dyke and a handful of others, Daniel spent the winter at a place known as Mast Camp. Their purpose was timber. The forests here held enormous white pines, prized by the British Crown as masts for the Royal Navy. Through the long winter, Daniel and the other men worked to bring them down. It was difficult, isolated work. The days were spent among the trees. The nights offered little more than whatever crude shelter the camp could provide against the New Hampshire winter. Daniel was far from home, far from Anne, far from his 2 young daughters. And yet, something about this place must have appealed to him. Because, when spring finally came, Daniel did not simply return to Sutton and leave the wilderness behind. Instead, he decided to make this remote lumber camp his home. That summer, Anne and their children came north to join him. Other families from Sutton followed. Among them were Anne's father, Samuel Chase, and her brother Jonathan. Together, the Putnams, the Chases, and a small group of other settlers began the difficult work of turning wilderness into a community. A new settlement was taking shape along the Connecticut River. Its name was Cornish. The Putnams and the Chases did more than settle here. They helped govern the community that they had built. Samuel Chase served as a selectman and presided over the town's first meeting. Daniel Putnam would serve as a selectman as well, and by 1774 he was the town clerk, the man entrusted with keeping the records of this young frontier town. But events far beyond Cornish were about to change everything. In April of 1775, blood was shed at Lexington and Concord. And when the news reached New Hampshire, Samuel Chase was there representing Cornish in the colony's legislature as it voted to support the fight for independence. To do that, the colony needed soldiers. Daniel Putnam would be one of them. About 60 miles west of Cornish stood Fort Ticonderoga. Built by the French during the French and Indian War, the fortress commanded the passage between Lake Champlain and Lake George, the great north-south corridor between Canada and the colonies. Whoever controlled Ticonderoga controlled the gateway between them, and in the spring of 1775, the fort contained something the Americans desperately needed: cannon. Almost simultaneously, and independently of one another, 2 men recognized the opportunity: Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. Arnold urged the Massachusetts government to authorize an expedition against the fort, offering to lead the attack himself. Massachusetts agreed, giving him a commission and authority to raise men for the mission. But as Arnold made his way toward Ticonderoga, he discovered that another expedition was already underway. Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys were preparing to seize the fort themselves. When Arnold arrived, the 2 men argued over who would command. Neither was willing to step aside. In the end, they went forward together. Before dawn on May 10, 1775, Allen, Arnold, and fewer than 100 men crossed Lake Champlain and approached Ticonderoga under the cover of darkness. The small British garrison stationed there apparently did not know that the revolution had started and surrendered without a fight. Arnold wished to press the momentum and urged Congress to authorize an invasion of Canada. That summer, an invasion of Canada was organized. An American army under Richard Montgomery advanced north from Ticonderoga, while Benedict Arnold led a second force through the wilderness of Maine toward Quebec. By November, Montgomery had captured Montreal. Quebec, however, proved more difficult. It was better defended and more fortified than Montreal. Leaving a garrison in Montreal, Montgomery turned his army east and joined Arnold outside Quebec. The two rendezvoused outside the city on December 3rd. Even with the addition of Montgomery's soldiers, the army laying siege to Quebec was undermanned and undersupplied. The march through the Maine wilderness had been very difficult. The army lost many men and much of its supplies. To make matters worse, disease such as smallpox and dysentery were running through the camp. With the weather starting to turn badly, supplies running dangerously low, and enlistments set to run out at the end of December, Montgomery, probably more out of desperation than strategic advantage, decided to go through with the assault. The attack was an absolute disaster. Montgomery and several of his men were killed almost immediately. Benedict Arnold was badly wounded as well. While Arnold's men managed to fight their way into the lower town, they were immediately surrounded. Hundreds were forced to surrender. The rest fled. By morning, the attack had collapsed. Quebec remained in British hands, and the American army outside its walls was badly weakened. When George Washington learned of the catastrophe at Quebec, he did not wish to abandon the invasion of Canada. He understood Canada's strategic value to the British as a potential staging area to launch invasions into New England and New York. He sat at his desk and wrote a letter to Colonel Timothy Beadle of New Hampshire. In it, he wrote, "The Continental Congress, having called upon the government of New Hampshire to raise a regiment for the service of the United Colonies," he asked that Beadle raise the said regiment and march it into Canada, explaining the necessity of reinforcing our troops posted before and forming the blockade of Quebec. Within days of Beadle receiving Washington's letter, Daniel has already enlisted. The company quickly leaves Cornish and marches to Fort Ticonderoga, where they meet the rest of the regiment. From there, they begin the long trek to Quebec. Reaching Quebec in late winter, they relieve and reinforce Arnold's beleaguered army. But problems of inadequate supplies and rampant disease around camp persist. They maintain the blockade into the spring, engaging only in scattered skirmishes with British soldiers who venture out from behind the safety of the walls. The uneasy standoff is broken in May of 1776, when thousands of British soldiers, under the command of General John Burgoyne, begin arriving in Canada. Benjamin Franklin, who is in Canada with John Hancock on a campaign to convince the Canadians to join the Revolution, writes in a letter to Congress, "We are informed that 2 men of war, 2 frigates, and 1 tender arrived there early on Monday the 6th, about 11 o'clock. The enemy sallied out, to the number, as is supposed, of 1,000 men." He describes in his letter how the Americans were unprepared to meet a British attack and were quickly overrun, losing over 500 muskets and about 200 men. He goes on saying, "The retreat, or rather flight, was made with the utmost precipitation and confusion." Most of the 200 soldiers lost are captured in the infirmary, too sick to join the army during the retreat. A letter that Daniel would write after the war states that he,
in the year 1776, engaged as a soldier in the company of Timothy Beadle,
and that he
marched with the troops to Quebec, where I was taken sick and had the misfortune to lose my clothes in the retreat from Canada.
Not far into the retreat, Daniel becomes too sick to keep up.
And being left by the troops and with no one to care for me.
The army moves on without him. Now he is alone, ill, far from home, and traveling through a country where he cannot know who is friend and who is enemy. The people he encounters face the same uncertainty. Loyalties throughout Canada and northern New York are deeply divided. Some support the American cause, others remain loyal to the crown, and many want little more than to survive a war that has arrived at their doorstep. Taking an American soldier into your home carries risks. If British troops, loyalist militia, or hostile neighbors discover him there could be consequences. And Daniel has no way of knowing whether the stranger opening the door intends to shelter him or turn him over to the British. But someone does open the door. For Daniel, recovery is now a race against time. The Continental Army is retreating farther away with each passing day, taking its protection with it. Daniel is left behind in increasingly dangerous territory, unable to travel and dependent upon strangers for his survival. Every day that he remains there increases the odds of discovery. He needs to become strong enough to move before someone finds him. Daniel receives medical care and a place to stay while he is sick. The cost comes to 16 pounds, roughly 8 months of a Continental private's salary. We don't know the names of the people who care for him. We don't know what they believe about the revolution. We only know that when Daniel Putnam was sick, alone, and hundreds of miles from his family in Cornish, strangers take him in. And because they do, he survives. Daniel slowly recovers and eventually is healthy enough to begin his journey home. Somehow, he manages to get home. He hitches rides on wagons when he can, finds passages on boats when he can, and walks when he must. For Daniel Putnam, the ordeal in Canada is finally over. But his war, and the war for American independence, is only just beginning. The year opens with Daniel back at home with a decision to make. With his enlistment expired and his obligation met, does he re-enlist or does he resume normal life as a civilian? On the one hand, he strongly believes in the cause of independence. His entire extended family is deeply patriotic. His father-in-law is an outspoken advocate for independence in the state assembly. His brother-in-law has recently been promoted to the rank of general in the state militia. Not to mention that he is also related to General Israel Putnam, who, during the Battle of Bunker Hill, famously instructed his troops not to fire until they saw the whites of the British soldiers' eyes. On the other hand, Daniel had already been to war and seen it with his own eyes. He had been shot at by professional British soldiers. He had witnessed firsthand how disorganized and inexperienced the Continental Army was, and how poorly supplied its soldiers were. At the end of 1776, the revolution was going very poorly. The British have recently landed a major army in Canada, and now control New York City, having badly defeated George Washington at the battles of Long Island and Fort Washington. Even with Washington's recent victory at Trenton and his famous crossing of the Delaware River, American prospects are bleak. And, to top it all off, Congress has recently required that all men enlist for a minimum of 3 years. Daniel and his family ask themselves, and each other, how much are they willing to risk for this fledgling American cause? How much are they willing to sacrifice? The answer comes in February, when Daniel enlists in the newly formed 1st New Hampshire Regiment under the command of General Enoch Poor. Perhaps some context can be provided from this 1777 document. In it, Daniel acknowledges receiving 20 pounds as a bounty for signing up for 3 years. He is assigned to Colonel Joseph Silly's regiment. Their first mission? To defend the fort at Ticonderoga. By the middle of May, Daniel's 1st New Hampshire Regiment is stationed at Fort Ticonderoga. Responsibility for the defense of the North belongs to Major General Philip Schuyler. At Ticonderoga, Schuyler has Major General Arthur St. Clair in command. Scottish-born and a veteran of the British Army during the French and Indian War, St. Clair knows both the country and the enemy he is preparing to face. And the position he has been given to defend is one of the most important in America. Fort Ticonderoga guards the Great Northern Gateway into the United States. There is no practical land route from Canada to the Hudson River Valley. Any British Army intending to move south must pass within firing distance of the fort. The previous year, 1776, a smaller American force stopped a British advance here. Now, St. Clair has roughly 3,000 men to defend Ticonderoga and the fortifications across the lake at Mount Independence. In June, General John Burgoyne leaves Canada with an army nearly 3 times that size. His objective is not merely Ticonderoga, it is Albany. If Burgoyne can force his way down the Lake Champlain corridor and reach the Hudson, the British hope to isolate New England from the rest of the United States, effectively ending the Revolution. For the Americans, the fort is their Thermopylae, a narrow passage where geography allows a smaller army to stop a much larger one. But like Thermopylae, it has a fatal flaw. Towering hundreds of feet above Fort Ticonderoga looms Sugarloaf Mountain. It is too tall and too steep and too far for the British to haul cannons, and therefore it is left unguarded. Burgoyne and his 9,000 troops arrive at Ticonderoga on July 1st. The next day, they begin to encircle the fort. On July 5th, just 4 days after Burgoyne's arrival, the Americans are shocked to see 2 12-pound cannons staring down at them from Sugarloaf. British engineers, apparently, have found a way to get cannons up the steep hill. St. Clair, realizing that there is no way to defend the fort against these guns, orders that Ticonderoga be abandoned. The fort, thought to be the Gibraltar of the North, the impenetrable fortress that was to keep the British in Canada and out of New York, has fallen without a shot being fired and less than a week after the British arrival. The Congress and the American public are shocked and furious. Schuyler is relieved of command. St. Clair is later court-martialed. The army retreats south, and a few days later arrives in the town of Salem, New York, and the farm of John and Eleanor Little. The Littles are Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, part of a congregation that relocated from Ballabay, Ireland about 15 years prior, when their pastor had a dispute with the Crown and the Church. They are ardent patriots and allow the army to camp on their farm. They offer their house to the officers and to General St. Clair, while the rest of the army camp in the field. They will pay a dear price for their patriotism and their hospitality. Not long after St. Clair's departure, their sons, Isaac and William, are captured by a local Tory militia and taken to Burgoyne's army as prisoners of war. In a separate incident, their 16-year-old daughter Rebecca and 10-year-old daughter Esther are taken as prisoners while working in the fields. From Salem, the army heads south toward a small farming community called Stillwater and a bluff overlooking it called Bemis Heights. Before being relieved of command, Schuyler had ordered that the army rendezvous here to make their next stand. He is very familiar with Stillwater, owning thousands of acres of land there, and knows firsthand the defensive advantages that Bemis offers. In the weeks that follow, almost all of the fighting between the British and the Americans takes place on land that Philip Schuyler owns. Bemis has the advantages of Ticonderoga, including command and control of the river and the road, without the disadvantages. This is the high ground, and this time the Americans are fortifying it. It also offers one distinct advantage: concealment. There's no easy way for Burgoyne or his scouts to tell where the American forces are or where their lines end. This forces the British to move through the area slowly. It also gives the Americans ample places to hide, where they can scout and ambush. Horatio Gates, a former British officer, is sent by Congress to lead the defense at Bemis. He has a reputation for being cautious and thoughtful. George Washington, perhaps believing that a more energetic presence was needed, sends Benedict Arnold. Brilliant Polish military engineer Tadeusz Kosciuszko is sent to assist Gates in designing the defenses. He sets up a battery of roughly 24 cannons with an interlocking firing pattern. From here, they can hit virtually anything on the river or the road. The Americans have complete control of the Hudson. As the British approach Stillwater, they realize that they cannot go around Bemis. They can see that there are too many cannons for them to take the river or the road that runs along the river. They know little else about the American position. On September 18th, Burgoyne's army reaches the outskirts of the American position at Bemis Heights. He knows Gates is somewhere ahead, but that's about all he knows. The Americans have chosen their ground well. Their defenses are hidden among the trees, protected by steep hills, and anchored to the Hudson River. Burgoyne cannot see the strength of the fortifications, nor can he tell how many men stand behind them. Attacking blindly would be reckless. So, the next morning, Burgoyne sends 3 columns forward to probe the American position. His mission is simple: find the enemy. If the opportunity presents itself, attack. If not, return with information. But the Americans aren't willing to wait behind their defenses. General Benedict Arnold recognizes Burgoyne's plan for what it is. Every step that the British take reveals more about the American position. Arnold persuades Gates to let him meet the British before they can complete the reconnaissance. As Burgoyne's center column advances through the clearing around John Freeman's farm, it collides with Daniel Putnam, Joseph Cilley, and the men of Poor's brigade. What was meant to be a reconnaissance mission suddenly has become a pitched battle. For hours, the fighting surges back and forth across the open fields and into the surrounding woods. The smoke grows so thick that units lose sight of one another. Officers struggle to control the fighting. Regiments attack, fall back, and attack again. By sunset, the British still occupy Freeman's farm, but they have paid dearly for every yard of ground. By nightfall, Burgoyne's army holds the field, but it has come at a heavy cost. Hundreds of British and German soldiers lie killed or wounded, while the Americans withdraw to their defenses at Bemis Heights. And then, for more than 2 weeks, neither army makes another move. The British dig in and fortify their position around Freeman's farm, as they wait for badly needed reinforcements and supplies to arrive. They build 2 earthen forts called redoubts. One, called the Balcarres Redoubt, overlooks Freeman's farm and protects the main British position. Farther west, the Bremen Redoubt protects the army's right flank. For the moment, Burgoyne digs in and waits. Burgoyne's invasion from Canada is only one prong of a 3-point plan. General William Howe is to march his troops north from New York City, while Barry St. Leger takes a smaller diversionary force through the Mohawk Valley. The three armies are to rendezvous in Albany. St. Leger's advance has already been turned away after the siege of Fort Stanwix was broken by Benedict Arnold and a relief force sent by Gates. Burgoyne has not yet received word where General Howe and his men are. He hopes that the approach of a second British army from the south would force Gates to either abandon his position or to divert significant resources to face it. As September bleeds into October, Burgoyne's situation becomes increasingly desperate. His supplies are nearly exhausted. The army has only a few days' worth of food remaining, and horses are dying for lack of forage. American militia now control much of the surrounding countryside, making it increasingly difficult to gather provisions or receive reinforcements. And with each passing day, Gates's army grows larger while Burgoyne's grows weaker. Most troubling of all, Burgoyne has still heard nothing from General Howe's army in New York. On the evening of October 6, Burgoyne gathers his senior officers for a council of war. The situation is grim. Some recommend an immediate retreat toward Fort Ticonderoga while there's still a chance of escape. Others argue that retreat is no longer practical. American militia threaten every road to the north, and withdrawing the artillery, baggage, and wounded could quickly turn an orderly retreat into a disaster. Burgoyne rejects retreat. Instead, he makes one final gamble. Shortly after noon on October 7th, nearly 1,500 British and German troops advance toward the American left. It is intended as a reconnaissance in force, strong enough to probe the American line, gather desperately needed forage, and exploit any weakness that might appear. The Americans detect the movement almost immediately. Arnold recognizes Burgoyne's intentions at once and urges Gates to attack before the British can safely return to their own lines. Gates refuses Arnold's request for immediate attack. The argument between the two generals grows heated while the British continue their advance. Only after the fighting is already underway does Arnold finally return to the field. By then, the afternoon is slipping away. Once again, Daniel marches into battle under Benedict Arnold's command. The New Hampshire regiments meet Burgoyne's advancing force, while Daniel Morgan's riflemen strike from the opposite bank. The British advance slows, then stops, and finally begins to fall back. As Burgoyne's men withdraw toward the safety of their fortified camps, Arnold refuses to let them escape. He orders the brigade forward. The New Hampshire troops surge after the retreating British, turning an orderly withdrawal into a desperate fight for survival. During the pursuit, Colonel Silly's New Hampshire regiment, Daniel's regiment, overruns two British 12-pound cannon. The guns are captured, wheeled around, and turned against the Balcarres redoubt. 2.5 centuries later, they are still standing at the battlefield. The unexpected bombardment pins the defenses inside Balcarres. Unable to reinforce the British right, they can only defend their own position. Arnold immediately recognizes the opportunity. Though the sun is already sinking toward the horizon, he refuses to break off the attack. Instead, he leads the pursuit farther down the British line toward the Bremen redoubt, the anchor of Burgoyne's right flank. The Americans follow close behind, and as the last light of day begins to fade, they storm the redoubt. After fierce hand-to-hand fighting, the defenders are overwhelmed. The Bremen redoubt falls. For Burgoyne, the loss is catastrophic. His right flank has collapsed. His defensive line is broken. There is no longer any hope of holding the camp. Soon after Bremen falls, the Balcarres redoubt is overrun. The persistence of Arnold's attack has turned the orderly British retreat into a full-on rout. As darkness falls, the British prepare to withdraw. To conceal their movement, they leave their campfires burning. While the fires continue to flicker through the night, Burgoyne slips away toward a small town called Saratoga. hoping to save what remains of his army. The British reach Saratoga, but from there is nowhere left to go. American militia close in from every direction, while Gates's army blocks the road to the south. Rations are nearly gone. Horses are slaughtered for food. Every day, more American soldiers arrive as Burgoyne comes to accept that Howe's army isn't going to rescue him. Finally, on October 17, 1777, General John Burgoyne marches out to surrender his army. Daniel Putnam stands among the thousands of Continental soldiers witnessing one of the greatest victories of the Revolutionary War. Just 4 months earlier, he had fled Fort Ticonderoga before the same enemy. Now, he watches it lay down its arms. It is the first time in the history of the British Empire that a major field army has surrendered to a foreign power. Among the Americans accepting the surrender are two familiar faces. Daniel's brother-in-law, General Jonathan Chase, helps draft the Articles of Convention that formalize Burgoyne's surrender, while Jonathan's father, Samuel Chase, at the age of 70, is also present with Jonathan's New Hampshire militia. More than 5,000 British, German, and Canadian troops become prisoners of war. News of the victory races across the Atlantic, convincing France that the American cause can succeed. Within months, France enters the war as America's ally, transforming the revolution into a global conflict. The surrender also vindicates one of the revolution's most controversial decisions. General Arthur St. Clair had been condemned for abandoning Fort Ticonderoga without a fight in order to save his army. Months later, when he is tried by court-martial, he is acquitted with honor. The very soldiers he saved had forced Burgoyne's capitulation. The Battle of Bemis Heights, what historians will refer to as the Second Battle of Saratoga, is the last major battle Daniel Putnam will fight. With Burgoyne defeated, Sibley's regiment marches south to join Washington's army at Valley Forge. Daniel marches with them. But before the worst of the winter sets in, Daniel receives a new assignment. He becomes an army blacksmith, a trade he had occasionally practiced before the war. Soon afterward, he is sent to the Continental Army's great supply depot at Fishkill, New York. It is a different kind of battlefield. Far from the roar of cannon, thousands of soldiers, craftsmen, teamsters, and laborers work together to keep Washington's army supplied. Every musket that breaks, every wagon wheel that splinters, every horseshoe that wears thin, every camp kettle, nail, hinge, tool, and gun part that must be repaired or replaced, eventually finds its way to an armory like Fishkill. For Daniel, the forge becomes the front line. Day after day, iron is heated, hammered, and shaped into the countless items that an army cannot fight without. The work is exhausting. It is repetitive, and it is absolutely essential. Fishkill becomes the Continental Army's principal supply depot for one simple reason: geography. The Hudson River flows just to the west, providing a natural highway for moving food, ammunition, cannon, and military supplies. Roads from New England, the Hudson Valley, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania converge here, allowing those supplies to be collected, repaired, stored, and redistributed wherever they are needed. Close enough to support Washington's army, far enough from British-controlled New York City to remain comparatively secure. No place in the northern colonies is better suited to become the logistical heart of the American war effort. Just a few miles upriver stands the fortress that protects it. West Point occupies the commanding heights where the Hudson River cuts through the rugged highlands. Any British ship attempting to sail farther north must pass beneath its guns. The surrounding mountains also channel one of the principal corridors linking New England with the middle colonies through this narrow passage. Late in 1779, after returning from the Sullivan expedition against the Iroquois, Sibley's regiment joins the growing American garrison in the Hudson Highlands. Daniel once again returns to his company. In December of 1778, Daniel is granted a furlough and returns home to Cornish. His eldest daughter Elizabeth is not quite 17, and she is preparing to marry. The young man's name is David Haskell. And like so many of the other men in Elizabeth's life, David is a veteran of the Revolution. He has recently mustered out after more than 2 years of service. He answered the call to alarm on April 19, 1775, and formally enlisted the following day. He also served at the Siege of Boston. Perhaps Daniel's furlough helps determine the timing of the wedding. With no way of knowing when her father might next be home, or even if he will return home safely, the family may simply seize the opportunity. In February of 1779, just weeks before her 17th birthday and only days before Daniel's furlough is set to expire, Elizabeth Putnam marries David Haskell. By the summer of 1780, the war has settled into a stalemate. The Continental Army still holds the Hudson Highlands, and no position is more important than West Point. Perched high above the Hudson River, its guns command the river and protect the vital supply depots at Fishkill, only a few miles away. If the British seize West Point, they can split New England from the rest of the young nation. No one understands its importance better than Benedict Arnold. Still celebrated as the hero of Saratoga, Arnold lobbies George Washington for command of the fortress. Washington agrees. Whatever Arnold's personal faults may be, no one doubts his courage or his military ability. If anyone can restore West Point's neglected defenses, Washington believes that it is Benedict Arnold. Daniel is reintegrated into the New Hampshire 1st after more than 2 years of detached service as a blacksmith. His regiment is assigned to patrol and secure West Point and the surrounding highlands. But while the soldiers at West Point labor to strengthen the post, their commander is quietly planning to surrender it to the enemy. Then, on September 23, 1780, everything begins to unravel. A British officer traveling under the name of John Anderson is stopped by 3 New York militiamen near Tarrytown. Hidden inside his boot are detailed plans of West Point in Benedict Arnold's own hand. The prisoner soon reveals his true identity. He is Major John Andre, the British officer secretly negotiating Arnold's betrayal. As word races toward West Point, George Washington is already on his way to inspect the fortress and to meet with Arnold. On the morning of September 25th, Washington arrives expecting to find one of his most trusted generals. Instead, Arnold is nowhere to be found. Only moments before Washington's arrival, Arnold has received word that Andre had been captured. Realizing that the plot has been exposed, he abandons his breakfast table, rushes to the Hudson River, and escapes aboard the British warship Vulture. Washington can scarcely believe what he is hearing. The hero who fought so brilliantly at Quebec and Saratoga, the man he personally selected to command the most important fortress in America, has betrayed his country. The shock is profound. Officers and soldiers throughout West Point learn that the man directing their work has been secretly preparing to hand the fortress, and perhaps the revolution itself, to the British. For Daniel Putnam, this betrayal is particularly personal. 4 years earlier, his Revolutionary War began in Benedict Arnold's desperate campaign into Canada. His last great battle was Saratoga, where Arnold earned his greatest victory. And now, at West Point, Daniel is there to witness the stunning collapse of Arnold's American career. While not verifiable through any documentation from the event, according to family tradition, Daniel is given the solemn duty of removing Andre's shackles as he is led to the gallows to be executed as a spy. Daniel's enlistment comes to an end December 1781, not long after Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown. The victory at Yorktown is decisive, but no one knows that the war is over. Daniel re-enlists for one final term. Alongside his son-in-law, David Haskell, He spends the closing years of the war serving with the Continental Army along New York's northern frontier. Stationed at places such as Saratoga, the Army settles into the routine of garrison life while diplomats work toward peace. Ironically, Daniel's life as a soldier has become quieter than the life he left behind in Cornish. For a time, the people of Cornish find themselves in an extraordinary situation. Their town is claimed by two governments. To the west lies the independent Republic of Vermont. To the east, the state of New Hampshire. Cornish effectively has two competing town governments. Each holds its own meetings, each elects its own officers, each levies its own taxes. Each claims the authority to govern the very same people. At the center of the controversy stands Daniel's father-in-law, Samuel Chase. More than any other man in Cornish, Chase champions the movement to unite the town with Vermont. According to later testimony, he tirelessly lobbies his neighbors and denounces those who oppose the effort. But political fortunes change. When Cornish ultimately seeks to return to New Hampshire, Samuel again becomes one of its leading voices. For his role in reversing course, the Republic of Vermont briefly imprisons him. By the time the Treaty of Paris is signed in 1783 and Britain's recognition of American independence becomes official, the most turbulent chapter of the Cornish controversy has passed. Although disagreements linger for years, Cornish remains part of New Hampshire. Daniel finally returns home. The marching is over. The extraordinary years are over. The ordinary years begin. Daniel returns to Cornish, to his farm, to his family, to his forge. The surviving records no longer tell stories of marches and battles. Instead, they tell stories of neighbors. Daniel returns to the trade he had practiced before the Revolution. At his forge, he repairs tools, shoes horses, and fashions the ironwork needed by a growing frontier community. The work is demanding, but it is peaceful. The concerns of daily life are no longer armies and campaigns, but farms, roads, ferries, and neighbors. One deposition records Daniel's testimony concerning the ferry road and landing on the Connecticut River. The crossing had become an important part of life in Cornish, but the road leading to it crossed Jonathan Chase's property, bringing a steady procession of travelers, wagons, and livestock across his land. Daniel's testimony preserves not only the details of the controversy, but also his own voice describing the everyday concerns of the community he helped build.
I, Daniel Putnam, of lawful age, do testify and say that I was one of the first settlers of the town of Cornish. For many years there was not a road on the west side of the river, and it became necessary that there should be a ferry to cross the river from Cornish to Windsor. And the select men of Cornish, having the honor to be one of them myself, concluded that the most proper place for said ferry would be to cross the river from Colonel Jonathan Chase in Cornish, and that the ferry road must go through Colonel Chase's meadow, and did go through said meadow for many years to his great damage. Cattle increased, and in such great droves that I have known them to lay in the meadow for half a day at a time before they could possibly get across, and indeed did great damage to the grain as well as grass.
The court records tell a similar story. Daniel's name appears from time to time, not as a soldier, but as a farmer, a blacksmith, and a neighbor. Accounts, debts, everyday disputes, the ordinary business of life in a small frontier town. After everything he had endured during the Revolution, they were wonderfully ordinary concerns. For Daniel, the war is over. But one issue from the Revolution remains unresolved. Years after the fighting has ended, Daniel joins many of his fellow citizens in signing a letter protesting what they describe as Vermont's continued mistreatment of those living along the Connecticut River. The musket has given way to the pen. The battles are now fought with testimony, petitions, and the rule of law.
That the inhabitants of a certain territory of land west of the Connecticut River have associated together and assumed jurisdiction by the name of the state of Vermont. They exercise many and various acts of oppression, injustice, and cruelty toward the good subjects of the state of New Hampshire by seizing and embezzling our property. Farther, the inhabitants of said territory do in a lawless and riotous manner make inroads on the frontiers of this state and take hence the peaceable subjects of New Hampshire.
The letter is effective, and Vermont agrees to compensate Samuel Chase for imprisoning him and relinquishes all claims to Vermont lands owned by the men of Cornish. Not long after, he begins to withdraw from public life, welcomes grandchildren, and retreats to the tranquility of his farm on the Connecticut River. The years pass quietly. Daniel Putnam dies in 1809. Today, he rests beside Anne at Trinity Church in Cornish. Just a few yards away lie Samuel Chase, Jonathan Chase, and the family whose lives became inseparably intertwined with his own. After all the miles they marched, after all the hardships they endured, after the causes they championed, they rest together as neighbors. Their story reminds us that the American Revolution was never won by famous generals alone. It was won by ordinary men and women who answered the call, endured extraordinary sacrifices, and then returned home to build farms, raise families, settle communities, and leave behind a nation still worthy of remembering. Daniel Putnam was one of them. Visitors to Fort Ticonderoga will pass, as they enter, a bronze marker. It is dedicated to Colonel John Brown. In September of 1777, a day before Burgoyne would first engage Gates at the Battle of Freeman's Farm, Brown led an assault on Fort Ticonderoga. The British garrison, under the command of General Henry Powell, managed to drive back the attack, but not before Brown and his men freed some 100 American prisoners of war. Among them were Isaac and William Little, the sons of John and Eleanor Little of Salem, who hosted St. Clair and his army as they retreated south from Ticonderoga. After the war, Isaac purchased several thousand acres of land as an investment in the newly formed St. Lawrence County. Isaac's daughter Eleanor married a man named Leonard Herrick. In 1807, they had a daughter whom they named Polly. In 1808, Leonard was convicted of forging banknotes and was sentenced to life in prison. To help her start a new life, Isaac gave Eleanor several hundred acres of the land holdings he had in St. Lawrence, and soon Eleanor and Polly relocated there. At around the same time, Daniel's daughter Elizabeth and her husband David Haskell also moved to St. Lawrence County, bringing with them their daughter Cornelia. In 1856, Eleanor's grandson William married Cornelia's granddaughter Adeline. 80 years after the Littles took in Daniel Putnam and the Continental Army and gave them shelter, and over 200 miles away from Cornish, the two families became one.